Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antranig Kechijian, and today I'm excited to share with you my analysis of macroeconomic factors that may be associated with spear-phishing cyber attacks from Russia. Here's just a brief overview of what we'll be going over today, starting with an introduction. Before we dive into the details of this analysis, I think it's important to talk about what spear-phishing is. As you can see from this description, spear-phishing is essentially when someone pretends to be someone they're not to steal someone's information online and then use this information to blackmail them, steal large sums of money, or do one of many malicious things. As far as this project goes, my main goal was to analyze this important issue of spear phishing through a macroeconomic lens and determine if there are any significant associations between three key macroeconomic indicators, in this case GDP, unemployment, and primary school enrollment, with the outgoing rates of these phishing cyber attacks from Russia. And the reason I chose these three variables in particular is because I think together these variables do a good job of encapsulating Russia's labor market, production capability, and education, and generally provide a good holistic sense of the condition of the macroeconomy at various points in time. But why conduct this analysis specifically? Well, I wanted to focus on Russia because, as I'm sure many of you know, Russia is incredibly infamous for being a cybercrime threat, especially after the 2016 election. I wanted to focus on spear phishing because this is an incredibly dangerous and common form of cyber attack, and because it really preys on human error, all individuals and organizations are susceptible to it. And finally, I wanted to conduct a macroeconomic analysis because, in my opinion, this issue isn't explored thoroughly in existing literature through a macroeconomic lens, and I think exploring it in this way can potentially lend itself to some policy-based solutions. Let me just do a quick overview of the literature review. Here are just three key themes I noticed when reading literature about spear phishing, namely the rapid advancement of Russia's sophisticated cyber tools, a shift in Russia's educational system after the collapse of the USSR to be very technically oriented, and finally, the rise of spear phishing and its use to attack Western governments, namely the US, the EU, various other European defense ministries, and more. So now I'll talk about my methodology for this study. The study is broken down into two key parts, the first being a more quantitative data analysis, where I take our three independent variables and create three separate linear regression models on our dependent variable of the rate of cyber attacks, and then explore any significant relationships there. And as I'm sure many of us know, a key limiting factor in social science research and analyses like these is that we can't really perform this type of analysis in a controlled setting, and we can't really imply causality or anything like that. But rather than just take these associations at face value, make some guesses about why we're seeing what we're seeing and calling it a day, I wanted to take it a step further and look at some primary and secondary research to help see if the research of others can help explain any insights we find in our novel data models. Again, with the ultimate goal to see if we can get any insight of how these macroeconomic issues can help explain the rate of cyber attacks. Let me just go into the data analysis. First, these are just the two sources I got the data from. Another thing I want to mention is an important caveat, which is that the cyber attack data, which came from the Council on Foreign Relations, includes spear phishing attacks, but isn't limited to them, meaning that the trends we'll see in the model are based on all outgoing cyber attacks from Russia and not just spear phishing attacks. However, to refocus the scope of this analysis, the primary and secondary sources mainly focus on the GRU, which is Russia's military agency that's primarily responsible for the spear phishing attacks. So let's look at our first model, starting with the least interesting. This is our regression of GDP on the rate of cyber attacks. And as you can see pretty clearly by the relatively flat trend line, there's not a whole lot going on here. The relatively low correlation coefficient and the high variance really suggest that there's not a ton of further exploration to be done into this relationship specifically. However, a far more interesting model is our analysis of unemployment by cyber attacks. We can see here that there appears to be a pretty strong negative association with these two variables, with years of lower unemployment being associated with a higher number of attacks per year, and the opposite being true for years with higher unemployment. Now, we'll see later on in our analysis that the labor market and its interaction with people's decision-making and the job market is important. However, another important analysis, and in my opinion, the most important relationship in this analysis, is the relationship between primary school enrollment and the rate of cyber attacks. As you can see here, there's a pretty strong positive association between these two variables, meaning that years that are associated with higher primary school enrollment are associated with a higher rate of attacks. And we'll see that there's actually a pretty good explanation for this later on. But before we dive into the primary and secondary sources, I did just want to recap what we saw in the data models. The first insight being that GDP doesn't seem to have a strong relationship with the rate of cyber attacks. However, unemployment seems to have a relatively strong negative association, and primary school enrollment seems to have a pretty strong positive association. So now let's look at our primary and secondary sources. First, let's look at the signed document between the official of a Russian public school and the commander of Russia's military intelligence unit. This document is really important to this analysis because it establishes a clear link between Russia's education system and the GRU, which is the entity that conducted all of their spear phishing attacks. And this is incredibly troubling, especially when we look at this article in the Washington Post, which explains these types of relationships. The author of this article conducted interviews with a student who attends a school who has a partnership with the GRU, and the student essentially talks about how the curriculum is very technical, math and computer science heavy, but in addition to that, also involves this element of military education and emphasizes respect for Russia's security services and has a sense of nationalism as well. And again, what's troubling even further is that the article talks about how the GRU has this type of influence with at least 6 other different public schools in Moscow. And that's just as of 2018 when this article is written. So there's potential that their influence is even more widespread now. As we saw in the data models, the relationship between unemployment and cyber attacks is important. So I did also want to touch upon the labor market. While this might be a little tricky to interpret at first, if we focus our attention to the leftmost graph, which is Russia's data, we can see by that third kind of lightly shaded bar that Russia has a relatively low current account to GDP ratio. Now, this is important because economically, this low ratio suggests that there's more of an outward flow of capital from Russia, meaning less resources are going in and more are going out. And this is typically indicative of a weaker domestic labor market. And this is important because it makes government jobs more appealing. Government jobs like working for the GRU or those other malicious entities that we learned about earlier. Additionally, I also wanted to speak to the high corruption perception in Russia's labor market because I feel like that's an important component of this analysis as well. It's important, again, because not only are these government entities directly influencing the education system in Russia, but the relatively weak, inefficient, and corrupt labor market really leaves them with no other better alternative to use their technical skills. As we can see in our conclusions, we can see that a really important factor when considering the relationship between education and the rates of these cyber attacks is the direct involvement of the entity conducting cyber attacks in the education system, which is a pretty big problem. And on top of that, we saw in our analysis of the labor market that it's possible that Russia's weak, corrupt, and efficient labor market, as well as a sense of nationalism we heard about in the Washington Post article, can really explain why government entities like the GRU really have no problem getting more and more talent and continuing to produce higher and higher rates of these attacks per year. With that in mind, here are just some ideas for discussion and further research. The first idea is more about the US specifically and how we can maybe kind of think about our own education policy and our own countermeasures to these initiatives with this new information in mind. And additionally, I also thought an interesting idea for further analysis would be examining the economic conditions of China and Iran. This is mainly because China and Iran are 2 other state entities who carry out very high rates of cyber attacks and are therefore somewhat similar to Russia in this context. So examining them in depth, seeing what the similarities and differences are, might give us even more insight into this issue and these relationships. Thank you so much for listening, and now I'm happy to take your questions.